The day my father passed away was the hardest day of my life. I remember standing by his hospital bed, holding his hand, feeling the warmth slowly fade away. My chest felt heavy, as though someone had placed a stone inside it. My father was more than just a parent. He was my guide, my strength, and the one person who always believed in me no matter what. Losing him felt like losing the ground under my feet. But even in that storm of grief, I knew one thing clearly. I needed time. I needed a few days to say goodbye to him properly, to arrange his funeral, to sit with my family and mourn together. So, after leaving the hospital that night, I told myself, tomorrow, I'll ask my boss for some days off. Surely she will understand. When I walked into the office the next morning, everything felt surreal. People were typing, making calls, rushing around like it was just another normal day. But for me, nothing was normal anymore. My world had just broken into pieces, and yet the office buzzed with the same old energy. I sat at my desk, staring blankly at the computer screen, until I finally gathered enough courage to walk into my boss's office. She was sitting there, scrolling through emails, her face tight with concentration. I knocked lightly. "Yes?" she said without looking up. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. I need to talk to you about something important." She raised her head now, finally noticing the seriousness in my voice. "What is it?" I took a deep breath. "My father passed away last night." The words came out heavier than I expected. Just saying them made my throat tighten. For a moment, her expression softened, and I thought she might say something kind. But then she leaned back in her chair, folded her arms, and said, "I'm sorry to hear that. But what exactly do you need?" I swallowed. "I need 4 days off. Just 4 days. To be with my family, to arrange the funeral, to say goodbye to him properly." Her eyes narrowed, and her lips pressed into a thin line. She tapped her pen against the desk. 4 days?" she repeated, as though I had asked for 4 months instead. "Yes," I said quietly. "Just 4. There was a long pause. She stared at me as if she was calculating the cost of my absence, as though my grief was a financial burden on her shoulders. Finally, she said, "You know we're in the middle of a critical phase right now. The clients are demanding updates, deadlines are tight, and we can't afford to lose focus. Do you really think you can just step away?" Her words stung. For a second I thought I had misheard her. My father was gone. And here I was, asking for a few days to lay him to rest. And she was talking about deadlines and clients. "I'm not asking for weeks," I said, my voice breaking a little. "It's only 4 days. Please understand he was my father." But she didn't soften. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Listen, I know it's difficult, but life goes on. The company needs you right now. If you walk away for 4 days, it will put everything at risk. Think carefully before you make a decision." Her words cut deeper than she probably realized. It wasn't just her refusal. It was the way she said it. Like my father's death was an inconvenience to her. Like my grief was a weakness that didn't deserve space in her world. I stood there, feeling a lump in my throat. Part of me wanted to shout, to slam my fists on her desk, to tell her how cruel she was being. But another part of me stayed calm, watching her with a strange clarity. At that moment, I realized something important. She was never going to care. To her, employees were machines, replaceable, disposable, useful only as long as they kept producing results. I nodded slowly, though my hands were trembling. "I understand what you're saying," I whispered. "But I need to be there for my family. My father deserves a proper goodbye." Her eyes flickered with irritation. "If you walk out now, don't expect your position to be waiting for you when you come back." Those words rang in my ears. I left her office quietly, my heart pounding. My coworkers looked up from their desks as I walked past, their eyes full of questions, but I didn't stop. I grabbed my things and left the building, the weight of her coldness pressing down on me. Out on the street, I felt the sun on my face, but inside, I was colder than ever. My boss had shown me who she truly was, a woman without compassion, without humanity. And even though grief filled me, a small spark lit inside me that day. Because I knew something she didn't. She thought she had the power. She thought she could treat me like nothing. But she had no idea that the projects she clung to so tightly, the ones she thought she had stolen and claimed as her own, were actually the seeds of her downfall. As I walked home, my eyes wet with tears, I held onto that thought. My father may have been gone, but I still carried his strength inside me, and while my boss believed she had won by refusing me those 4 days, she had no clue she was already standing on a trap I had built, one she would never escape. That day, as I prepared to bury my father, I also prepared something else, the quiet revenge that would bring justice to both me and him. The day after my father's funeral, I woke up with swollen eyes. Sleep had been shallow, broken by waves of grief and memories that came uninvited. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the framed picture of him on my nightstand. His smile was kind, his eyes full of pride. He always told me, "Stand tall, no matter what life throws at you." Those words echoed in my head as I remembered the last conversation I had with my boss. The way she looked at me when I begged for time to bury my father still burned inside me. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about dignity, respect, and the cruelty she had shown when I was at my weakest. That morning, as the world outside carried on like nothing had happened, I sat quietly in my small living room, surrounded by papers, files, and a laptop. These weren't just ordinary files. They were the heart of the projects my boss had stolen from me. She thought she had been clever, taking credit for my late nights, my strategies, my plans. She thought I hadn't noticed, but I had, and I had been careful. Long before my father passed, I had started keeping track of everything. Emails, drafts, original notes, all proof of what belonged to me. But I'd gone further than that. I had planted something deep inside those projects, like invisible threads only I could pull. My boss believed she was holding gold in her hands. What she didn't know was that those hands were already bleeding. I leaned back in my chair, my fingers tapping on the table. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock. And in that silence, a strange calmness washed over me. I realized that grief had given me clarity. My boss had denied me the most basic human right, to mourn my father. That cruelty had unlocked something inside me, something sharp. For days after the funeral, I split my time between my family and my silent plan. When my relatives gathered, crying and sharing memories, I stayed present, offering comfort. But at night, when everyone else had gone to bed, I opened my laptop and worked. Not for her, not for the company, but for myself and for the justice I knew was coming. Every document she flaunted in front of the clients, I had prepared it in such a way that the truth could unravel with one click. Every system she relied on, I had mapped it like the back of my hand. She thought she was the mastermind, but in reality, she was standing in a cage I had quietly built around her. I'll never forget the first time I saw her name in the news. It was a small feature. My company was being praised for an upcoming deal that she had supposedly secured. The article praised her leadership, her vision. I remember laughing bitterly when I read it. Her leadership? Her vision? No, those were mine. Those sleepless nights belonged to me. But instead of anger, I felt something else. Patience. A quiet voice inside me said, "Wait. Let her rise higher. The higher she climbs, the harder she'll fall." So I waited. I went about my days like a shadow. I didn't reach out to anyone from the office. I didn't argue or try to prove my worth. I simply disappeared from their world, letting them believe they had erased me. Meanwhile, I sharpened my weapons in silence. Weeks passed, then months. My boss was getting bolder. She took more credit, smiled brighter in photographs, and stood in front of clients as though she was untouchable. To everyone else, she looked like a star on the rise. But to me, she looked like someone dancing on a thin sheet of ice. I knew the cracks were already there. I had left them hidden in the foundation of her so-called empire, and when the time came, those cracks would split wide open. Sometimes, late at night, I would think of my father again. I remembered how he used to tell me, "Truth doesn't need noise. It just needs time." Those words guided me like a compass. I didn't want revenge that came from shouting or fighting. I wanted revenge that came quietly, naturally, like a storm no one saw coming. There were moments, of course, when doubt crept in. I wondered if I was being too cruel, if maybe I should just move on with my life. But then I remembered that office, that moment when I had stood in front of her, begging for just 4 days, and how she had looked at me with eyes full of calculation instead of compassion. That memory hardened me again. so I stayed the course. Every time she thought she had won, I reminded myself, this was only the beginning. She was celebrating too early. She didn't know that her kingdom was already poisoned, her crown already rusted. And as I sat there night after night, building my quiet web, I knew one thing for certain. When the day came, she wouldn't just lose her job or her reputation. She would finally understand what it felt like to be powerless, to have the ground pulled out from under her. The day after my father's funeral, I woke up with swollen eyes. Sleep had been shallow, broken by waves of grief and memories that came uninvited. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the framed picture of him on my nightstand. His smile was kind, his eyes full of pride. He always told me, "Stand tall, no matter what life throws at you." Those words echoed in my head as I remembered the last conversation I had with my boss. The way she looked at me when I begged for time to bury my father still burned inside me. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about dignity, respect, and the cruelty she had shown when I was at my weakest. That morning, as the world outside carried on like nothing had happened, I sat quietly in my small living room, surrounded by papers, files, and a laptop. These weren't just ordinary files. They were the heart of the projects my boss had stolen from me. She thought she had been clever, taking credit for my late nights, my strategies, my plans. She thought I hadn't noticed. But I had, and I had been careful. Long before my father passed, I had started keeping track of everything. Emails, drafts, original notes, all proof of what belonged to me. But I had gone further than that. I had planted something deep inside those projects, like invisible threads only I could pull. My boss believed she was holding gold in her hands. What she didn't know was that those hands were already bleeding. I leaned back in my chair, my fingers tapping on the table. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock, and in that silence a strange calmness washed over me. I realized that grief had given me clarity. My boss had denied me the most basic human right, to mourn my father. That cruelty had unlocked something inside me, something sharp. For days after the funeral, I split my time between my family and my silent plan. When my relatives gathered, crying and sharing memories, I stayed present, offering comfort. But at night, when everyone else had gone to bed, I opened my laptop and worked. Not for her, not for the company, but for myself, and for the justice I knew was coming. Every document she flaunted in front of the clients, I had prepared it in such a way that the truth could unravel with one click. Every system she relied on, I had mapped it like the back of my hand. She thought she was the mastermind. But in reality, she was standing in a cage I had quietly built around her. I'll never forget the first time I saw her name in the news. It was a small feature. My company was being praised for an upcoming deal that she had supposedly secured. The article praised her leadership, her vision. I remember laughing bitterly when I read it. Her leadership? Her vision? No, those were mine. Those sleepless nights belonged to me. But instead of anger, I felt something else. Patience. A quiet voice inside me said, "Wait. Let her rise higher. The higher she climbs, the harder she'll fall." So I waited. I went about my days like a shadow. I didn't reach out to anyone from the office. I didn't argue or try to prove my worth. I simply disappeared from their world, letting them believe they had erased me. Meanwhile, I sharpened my weapons in silence. Weeks passed, then months. My boss was getting bolder. She took more credit, smiled brighter in photographs, and stood in front of clients as though she was untouchable. To everyone else, she looked like a star on the rise. But to me, she looked like someone dancing on a thin sheet of ice. I knew the cracks were already there. I had left them hidden in the foundation of her so-called empire. And when the time came, those cracks would split wide open. Sometimes, late at night, I would think of my father again. I remembered how he used to tell me, "Truth doesn't need noise. It just needs time." Those words guided me like a compass. I didn't want revenge that came from shouting or fighting. I wanted revenge that came quietly, naturally, like a storm no one saw coming. There were moments, of course, when doubt crept in. I wondered if I was being too cruel, if maybe I should just move on with my life. But then I remembered that office, that moment when I had stood in front of her, begging for just 4 days. and how she had looked at me with eyes full of calculation instead of compassion. That memory hardened me again. So I stayed the course. Every time she thought she had won, I reminded myself, this was only the beginning. She was celebrating too early. She didn't know that her kingdom was already poisoned, her crown already rusted. And as I sat there night after night, building my quiet web, I knew one thing for certain. When the day came, she wouldn't just lose her job or her reputation. She would finally understand what it felt like to be powerless, to have the ground pulled out from under her. The office smelled the same as it always had. Coffee, cheap air freshener, the low hum of printers, but everything inside it felt false now. I used to walk those halls thinking my work mattered, that the late nights and careful plans were building something real. After my father died and after she refused me those 4 days, I saw the truth. My work had been valuable, but not to her in the way I imagined. To her, it was a commodity, something to be lifted and sold as her own. She didn't hide it well. At first, it was small things. A phrase from one of my reports would appear in her presentation slides. A spreadsheet I'd built would be presented under her name in a meeting. I would catch the nods and the compliments aimed at her, and my stomach would twist. I kept my evidence then, quietly, emails, drafts, versions with timestamps. I didn't have any illusions about confronting her directly. The kind of person she was would simply deny, gaslight, and redirect credit. So I did what careful people do when they're being erased. I documented everything, but documentation alone felt like a slow, unsatisfying consolation. I wanted more than proof. I wanted the truth to be unavoidable. If she was going to build a reputation on the back of my hours and ideas, then the structure she built would have to rely on the exact elements only I could supply. I began to prepare with that in mind, not through sabotage, but through design. Every major project I worked on had complex pieces that required intimate knowledge of the original thinking behind them. I didn't mean to leave traps that harmed anyone. I meant to make her success dependent on my craftsmanship. If she wanted credit, she would have to own the whole thing. If she had only taken the surface, the project would stall without the deeper work. When she took my work and rewrote the narrative, the world applauded. She stood on stages and talked about vision and leadership. She smiled for photos. She shook hands with clients while I watched from the periphery, a ghost among people who had once known me. I felt many things at those moments: anger, grief, a strange numbness. But I also felt the steadiness of someone who had a plan. I had a ledger of drafts saved to cloud folders and backed up across devices. I had original notes on my laptop, dated and annotated. I had a handful of colleagues who had seen the early stages and could confirm authorship if asked. Most importantly, I had kept the one thing that really matters in these situations: consistency. Every claim she made had a counterpoint in my files. Her theft was reckless because of how loudly she celebrated it. She quoted my language, used my frameworks, and when a client praised the team, she soaked up the words as if the team were hers alone. People loved a confident face on the podium. They loved simple answers. She gave them those things, and they adored her for it. I watched a woman transform borrowed ideas into social capital, the way a magician turns a coin into applause. She got invited to panels, given awards, and featured in newsletters. The higher she climbed, the more visible she became, and the more vulnerable she was to a collapse that could not be explained away as bad luck. I won't say I relaxed when things looked good for her. I was busy. I finished projects she had only started, wrote follow-ups and contingency plans, and continued to document my work in a way that would stand up to scrutiny. Where some people panic and act, I had learned to prepare and wait. Patience was my tool. My father used to say that storms reveal what's built on sand, and I believed him. If she had built her reputation on sand, the first real test would wash it away. The first crack showed in a harmless way. A client's question that required deeper explanation. A technical nuance she glossed over in a live demo. She smiled through it, deflected, and kept talking. But I could see the vulnerability in her posture. She began to lean on consultants and quick fixes, hiring external help to plug holes she could not explain herself. Each patchwork solution made the foundation shakier. She paid professionals to clean the visible mess while the underlying reasoning, the part that reflected genuine ownership, remained absent. At every little failure, The company's internal whispers grew louder. "We need to reassess," some managers said. "Who actually owns this?" Asked a client in an email thread I saw through a mutual connection. She handled those questions with bluster. She sent glossy reports with polished formatting and confident language. But the substance, when examined by someone who knew where the ideas started, had gaps you could not paper over. It was around this time that I realized the most powerful weapon wasn't a dramatic reveal or a public spectacle. It was the slow, inevitable accumulation of facts that would force people to ask uncomfortable questions. So I continued compiling. I organized my drafts, I collected version histories, and I reached out privately to a few people who had worked with me. Old teammates, who remembered which nights we had stayed late, and who had seen me present half-finished work that later bore her name. I asked them simply to keep records of their memories. Nothing dramatic, just notes that could corroborate timelines. I wasn't scheming to ruin anyone for sport. I was preparing to defend the truth if it ever mattered. The turning point came when one of the big projects she had publicly claimed began to falter in front of paying clients. The issue was technical enough that her quick patches couldn't fix it, and conceptual enough that it revealed a misreading of the underlying problem. The client, frustrated, asked for an explanation. The board convened. She scrambled to produce answers, but the people asking the hard questions wanted to see the logic, the drafts, the decisions that led to the current state. There was no logic to show. Only polished presentations and borrowed slides. At that meeting, I could see panic where there had once been smugness. I could see how quickly the applause on stages turned into pointed questions in boardrooms. She tried to deflect, blamed vendors, and suggested accelerated timelines. Those were temporary cover-ups. What the clients and the board wanted was accountability. They wanted to know who did what and why. The trail led nowhere that satisfied them, until someone found a discrepancy in the timeline presented to the client and the original timestamps on my drafts. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was a mess of facts that, when placed side by side, told a very different story. I didn't intervene with theatrics. I didn't march into a meeting and demand apologies. Instead, I let the papers do the talking. Emails, version histories, and the notes of colleagues who remembered the original drafts. All of it began to paint a picture that contradicted the narrative she had sold to everyone. As the evidence accumulated, the board could no longer ignore the mismatch. Questions moved from curious to accusatory. The same executives who had applauded her began to demand clearer proofs of ownership and process. When the truth finally surfaced in the right rooms, her reaction was dramatic, but not miraculous. Rage, denial, frantic emails, she tried everything. But the machine of transparency had already started to run. People wanted clarity, clients wanted the truth, and the board wanted to contain the fallout. Her reputation, built on borrowed brilliance, started to unravel. Watching that unraveling was not sweet in the way I had imagined as a child. It was complicated. I felt vindicated, yes, and I felt sorrow, for the waste, for the dishonesty, and for the way cruelty can co-opt creativity. Mostly I felt a quiet relief. The refusal that had been handed to me in the doorway of her office had been answered, not with a scream, but with a methodical, undeniable telling of the truth. By the time the company began formal investigations, I had everything I needed to show that much of what she presented as hers had roots in my work. It wasn't revenge as spectacle. It was restoration. I wanted acknowledgement, not to revel in ruin. But when the board finally confronted her with the evidence, the same people who once cheered her on had to face their role in enabling a false narrative. The fall came not because I plotted to hurt her, but because she chose to profit from other people's honest labor. The house of cards she had stacked on stolen work could not stand forever. When the walls finally began to crack around her, I thought maybe that would be enough. Maybe the truth surfacing in meetings, the whispers in the corridors, the questions she couldn't answer. That should have been the end. But it wasn't. She was stubborn, desperate, and proud. Instead of admitting fault or stepping back, she doubled down. She called emergency meetings, gave long speeches about loyalty and teamwork, and tried to paint herself as a victim of jealous colleagues. Watching her twist the story was exhausting, but also predictable. People like her don't surrender. They cling, even when their grip only makes their fall harder. That was when I realized I couldn't just rely on quiet truths being discovered here and there. I needed to finish what I had started. If she wanted to keep pretending she owned everything, then I needed to show, clearly and completely, that her empire was built on lies. Not just to a few people in a boardroom, but to everyone who had been fooled by her. I started with the files I had already collected. Years of work sat on my drives, early drafts, handwritten notes, emails with timestamps, voice memos I'd made while brainstorming. I went through everything carefully, organizing it into a timeline. My goal wasn't just to show what I'd done, but to show the exact points where she had taken my work and presented it as her own. I marked side-by-side comparisons, my words in an early draft, her words in a final presentation. The overlap was impossible to ignore. As I worked, I felt two emotions battling inside me. One was anger, sharp and heavy, pushing me forward, telling me to make her pay. The other was grief, quieter but steady, reminding me of my father. I kept hearing her voice in my memory. "You need to choose between work and family." Those words had burned into me like acid. She made me stand over my father's grave with the knowledge that she thought her projects, my projects really, were more important than saying goodbye to him. That was betrayal I could never forgive. Every time the grief made me pause, the anger lit me up again. Together, they became my fuel. The opportunity to act came sooner than I expected. A big industry event was coming up, a conference where she was scheduled to speak. She had been bragging about it for weeks, posting online, telling everyone that this was her chance to shine. The irony was almost poetic. She planned to give a talk built on stolen ideas to a room full of the very people who cared about authenticity, innovation, and leadership. I knew this was the stage where the truth had to come out. But I wasn't reckless. I didn't want to storm in and shout accusations. That would have made me look bitter or unstable. Instead, I decided to let the facts speak louder than anger ever could. I prepared a quiet package, a set of documents with the timeline, the drafts, and clear proof of authorship. I even included little details only the real creator could know. The way one equation had come to me after a night walk, the story behind a diagram I had sketched on the back of a receipt. It wasn't just technical evidence, it was human evidence, the kind no one could fake. On the morning of her big presentation, I sent that package to the event organizers, a few key clients, and the board. No dramatic headline, no angry rant, just the truth, neatly laid out, impossible to ignore. Then, I went to the conference myself. I wanted to see her face when the foundation she had built finally gave way. The hall was packed. She walked on stage in her usual polished way, dressed sharply, smiling like she owned the world. She started strong, delivering lines she had practiced 100 times. The audience clapped politely. But then, just a few minutes in, I noticed the shift. People in the front rows were checking their phones, whispering to each other, frowning. The organizers sitting near the stage started passing notes. The board members in the back leaned forward in their seats, their faces hard. She didn't see it at first. She was too wrapped up in her performance. But as the whispers spread and the energy in the room changed, her voice began to falter. She rushed her slides. She stumbled on phrases she normally delivered smoothly. Her smile wavered. Then one of the organizers walked on stage, quietly whispered in her ear, and handed her a folded paper. I knew what it was. I had seen that look before. The look of someone who suddenly realizes their stage isn't as solid as they thought. She tried to continue, but the audience wasn't buying it anymore. By then, half the people in the room had seen the evidence on their devices. They knew the truth. The visionary leader in front of them was presenting work that wasn't hers. The polite applause turned to cold silence. Some people walked out. Others stayed only to watch what felt like a public unraveling. I didn't cheer, I didn't laugh, and I didn't gloat. I just sat in the crowd, calm, steady, watching the justice unfold. For years, I had been invisible while she took credit for my work. In that moment, she was visible to everyone, but not in the way she wanted. The spotlight she had chased so desperately was now exposing her lies. Afterward, the fallout was swift. Clients pulled contracts. The board announced an internal review. The industry blogs picked up the story. Executive accused of stealing employees' work. Within days, her carefully built reputation collapsed. People who had once praised her now distanced themselves. The awards she had received were questioned. The panels she was invited to quietly dropped her from the lineup. And me? For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I could breathe. Not because I had destroyed her, but because I had restored the truth. I didn't want fame or applause. I only wanted the dignity of my work being acknowledged, and the peace of knowing my father's death had not been overshadowed by lies. When I left the conference that day, I walked out into the sunlight feeling lighter than I had in a long time. Revenge wasn't fire and fury. It was the quiet, steady unveiling of the truth. She had tried to make me choose between work and family. In the end, I chose neither. I chose justice. And it was enough. After the conference, I thought things would finally settle down. I thought she would quietly disappear, pack up her pride, and vanish from the spotlight. But I underestimated her. People like her don't fade away that easily. They claw, they scramble, and they try to rebuild their walls even when those walls are already collapsing around them. She tried everything. She went on interviews, crying about false accusations. She sent long emails to clients blaming me, calling me a bitter ex-employee who wanted attention. She even told the board that my proof was fabricated. It was almost laughable. After all, why would someone fabricate handwritten notes, old drafts and time-stamped files from years back? But desperation makes people say wild things. And she was desperate. Still, despite her attempts, the cracks were too deep now. People didn't trust her anymore. They might not have fully trusted me either, but the evidence spoke louder than both of us. She was on shaky ground, and she knew it. That's when she decided to turn her fire directly on me. At first, it was subtle. A rumor here, a whisper there, stories about how I was unstable, hard to work with, or jealous. I heard them in passing, like echoes traveling through the halls of the company. At first I brushed it off. Rumors are just noise, I told myself. But then, the noise grew louder. A few colleagues stopped talking to me. Meetings suddenly didn't include me. People hesitated to share updates with me. I could feel the distance building, brick by brick around me. That's when I realized her last weapon wasn't her reputation. It was mine. If she could destroy mine, she could rise again on the ashes. And I wasn't about to let that happen. I knew I couldn't fight rumors with anger. If I exploded, I'd look guilty. If I argued too much, I'd look defensive. Instead, I chose patience. I went back to the basics. The truth, my work, my consistency. While she threw tantrums in emails and interviews, I quietly kept producing results. While she attacked me, I stayed calm, polite, and professional. It wasn't easy. Some nights I lay awake, furious, imagining shouting matches and confrontations. But I kept those battles in my head, never in public. And slowly, it worked. People started noticing the difference. She was loud, chaotic, and bitter. I was steady, focused, and clear. It didn't erase the damage right away, but it planted doubt. And doubt is all I needed. But I also knew patience alone wouldn't finish this. She had already stolen years of my life, stolen credit, and tried to stain my name. If I wanted true closure, I needed to make sure there was no coming back for her. That meant exposing the one thing she had always hidden best, her greed. You see, while she was stealing my projects, she wasn't just stealing ideas. She was also quietly pocketing funds meant for development. I had noticed it before but hadn't been sure. The numbers had never lined up, but without hard proof, it was only suspicion. Now, with her reputation weak, I went digging again. I pulled old financial reports, traced invoices, and compared budgets against outcomes. The more I looked, the clearer it became. Money had been vanishing. Not just small amounts. Large sums. Enough to buy her fancy car, her luxury vacations, her perfect suits. She hadn't built her life on success. She had built it on theft. Finding that proof was like striking gold. But this time, I didn't go straight to the organizers or the board. No, this time I went higher, to the people who couldn't ignore it, the auditors, the regulators, the very system she thought she was too clever to be caught by. I sent them everything, neatly packaged, with no mention of revenge, no personal anger, just facts. Weeks later, it happened. I was sitting at my desk when the news broke. Investigators had arrived at her office. Files were taken, computers were locked, her accounts frozen. She didn't show up to work after that. The company released a statement. Our executive is under investigation for financial misconduct. And just like that, the final wall came crashing down. The same colleagues who once whispered rumors about me now whispered about her. The same people who had once doubted me now came to me quietly, saying things like, "I guess you were right all along," or, "I'm sorry for not believing you sooner." I didn't need their apologies, but hearing them still felt like a breath of fresh air. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't the one being questioned. She had tried to bury me with lies. She had tried to stain my reputation, ruin my career, and erase my dignity. But in the end, she buried herself. And all I had to do was keep shining the light of truth where her shadows tried to hide. I wish I could say I felt joy watching her downfall. But honestly, I didn't. What I felt was peace. A long, deep peace that wrapped around me like a blanket. For months, maybe years, I had been carrying the weight of her betrayal. The grief of my father's death and the sting of her words. Choose between work and family. Now that weight was gone. I thought about my father a lot during those days. He had always taught me that character mattered more than success, that truth mattered more than appearances. And now, standing on the other side of all this, I realized he was right. She had chosen appearances, lies, and greed. I had chosen patience, truth, and resilience. And in the end, truth had won. There was one more moment, though, that stays with me. A few weeks after her fall, I passed her on the street. She wasn't dressed in her usual sharp suit. She looked smaller somehow, weighed down, like the world had shrunk around her. Our eyes met for a moment. She opened her mouth, maybe to speak, but no words came. And me? I just nodded politely and walked past. I didn't need to say anything. Her silence said it all. Revenge, I learned, isn't always about shouting or fighting. Sometimes it's about waiting, working, and letting the truth do the heavy lifting. She wanted me to choose between work and family. In the end, I chose something else entirely. I chose justice, and justice chose me back. After she was exposed for financial fraud, everything unraveled faster than even I imagined. It was as if the world finally saw her for what she really was. Her name, once printed in bold letters on invitations and conference banners, now showed up in headlines with words like embezzlement and betrayal. She wasn't the respected leader anymore. She was the cautionary tale whispered about in hushed tones. For me, things changed too. Suddenly, people who once avoided me began to approach me again. The same colleagues who had believed her lies now spoke to me with respect in their voices. Clients who had pulled back because of the rumors now reached out, eager to work with me directly. My phone didn't stop ringing, and for the first time in a long while, the calls weren't about cleaning up her mess. They were about opportunities meant for me. It would have been easy to get swept up in the rush of it all, to enjoy watching her fall and bask in the glow of her humiliation. But honestly, that wasn't what I felt. Instead, I felt steady, grounded. All the sleepless nights, the humiliation of being mocked for wanting to bury my father, the weight of being silenced and pushed aside, all of it had led to this moment. And now, standing in the light of truth, I didn't feel like celebrating. I felt free. She didn't go quietly, of course. People like her rarely do. She fought hard, hiring lawyers, claiming she was the victim of a conspiracy. She blamed everyone except herself. But no matter how loud she screamed, no one believed her anymore. The documents were too clear, the proof too strong. The board cut ties, the clients cut ties, even the very friends she had once used to build her false empire walked away. She was left standing alone, clutching at excuses that no one cared about. The irony was almost painful. Years ago, she told me to choose between work and family, as if she had the power to decide what mattered in my life. She thought she had control, that her voice was the one that shaped my future. But now she had no control at all. Her empire was gone, her career destroyed, her reputation shattered. And me? I stood taller than ever. I remember one final meeting we had, though it wasn't planned. She showed up at the office months after everything had collapsed. She looked exhausted, her perfect image gone. The sharpness in her eyes had dulled, replaced with something closer to desperation. "I just want to talk," she said softly, almost whispering. I didn't lash out. I didn't shout. I simply listened as she tried to explain, to excuse, to twist the story one more time. She said she had been under pressure, that she never meant to hurt me, that things had just gotten out of control. When she finally stopped, waiting for me to respond, I said only this: "You asked me to choose between work and family. I chose truth, and now you know why." There was nothing else to say. I stood up and left the room, leaving her sitting there with the weight of her own choices pressing down on her shoulders. Life moved forward quickly after that. The projects I had worked on flourished. I gained not just recognition but respect, the kind that comes from proving yourself when the odds are stacked against you. The board even offered me a leadership position, something I never imagined back when I was just trying to survive under her shadow. I accepted, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted to build something real, something honest. And as I moved into that new chapter of my life, I thought often of my father. His voice still echoed in my head, reminding me of the lessons he taught me about integrity, patience, and resilience. He wasn't there to see it all, but in a way, this victory was his too. Everything I did, I carried his wisdom with me. As for her, the last I heard, she was still fighting legal battles, still clinging to fragments of a past that no longer existed. Maybe she'll spend the rest of her life trying to rebuild, or maybe she'll fade away completely. That's her story to write now, not mine. Mine is different. Mine is about surviving betrayal, about carrying grief, about holding on to the truth even when the lies are louder. It's about learning that revenge doesn't always mean shouting or fighting. It can also mean standing still, staying steady, and letting time reveal who people really are. I didn't destroy her. She destroyed herself. All I did was show the world what was already true. And if there's one lesson I've carried with me from all of this, it's this: betrayal can break you, but it can also build you. Greed may shine for a moment, but truth lasts far longer, and no matter how powerful someone seems, they can never bury the truth forever.